that despite kind of ongoing struggle and despite what people are going through, people who use drugs just have immense potential and a lot to give and can really change society, can change policies, and really can save lives.
You're listening to Narcotica, a podcast giving you the straight dope about drugs and the people who use them.
People who use drugs are intensely marginalized in society, existing in a world where structural violence regularly strikes. Bad things happen, and a lifelong accumulation of harm done can feel tremendously heavy. So drug use, maybe typically at first, is one way to make these burdens feel a bit lighter. Today, we'll be talking about the world of women who are incarcerated and criminalized for merely existing in this kind of world. Instead of being helped and treated compassionately, women who use drugs, especially if they're pregnant, typically face intense scrutiny by the police, the courts, the media, and social service institutions. I'm Zachary Siegel, and you're listening to Narcotica. With me today is a special guest, Dr. Kim Sue, the medical director of the Harm Reduction Coalition. Kim, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I'm just going to sort of list off your credentials here. You're a primary care doctor at Mass General Hospital, which is, Harvard's medical school, basically. And if that isn't impressive enough, you also have a PhD in anthropology. And so this, what we're going to be talking about is your book, which is ethnographic research. It's called Getting Wrecked: Women, Incarceration, and the American Opioid Crisis, published by the University of California Press. So did I get all that right?
Yeah, I did my medical residency and training at Mass General Hospital in primary care and internal medicine, but I'm not there anymore since I moved to New York. And most of the patients I see now for primary care are actually at Rikers Island.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, so maybe we'll get into it. Do you work with Dr. Giftos?
Yes, I do, very closely.
Yeah, I mean, wow, you two are like my favorite doctors on the planet.
We were just doing a training on a couple days ago together.
Wow. So to begin, I mean, I definitely want to talk more about that, but to sort of start off with Getting Wrecked and start off with your book, you write that this book explores what happens to women with opioid addiction inside the prisons and jails in Massachusetts and in the aftermath of incarceration. And so you undertook 2 years of ethnographic research inside of Massachusetts prisons and jails and the treatment community, maybe quote unquote treatment there. And so you spoke to over 30 women who were in this system, and you followed them as they tried to navigate the often Kafkaesque and labyrinth kind of bureaucracy in these institutions. Can you, maybe start by what motivated you to approach this, like, especially difficult topic?
Definitely. This topic intrigued me because in medicine, we often knew people became incarcerated for substance use. And I always wondered, what happens when women get arrested for a substance use issue. For us, we see people on the outside, we see them struggling, we hear they become incarcerated, it's a black box, we may or may not see them afterwards. And I really wanted to understand what happens to women on the inside. And I really felt that there was a place and a role for a medical anthropologist to kind of take that lens and look at, what actually does happen there, and then sort of tracing women longitudinally from before, during, and after. um, how does that affect them? And so that was the big question that I wanted to look at, and I had a lot of interest in this area because of the multiple tiers in which we as a society deal with substance use, right? My classmates at Harvard Medical School were using, buying, selling drugs of all kinds and varieties to treat many of the same issues that we know that people use drugs for in our society in the US more generally, for performance enhancement, to feel better, to self treat pain and anxiety. And yet they didn't go to prison or jail for that. So I was really interested in exploring, as part of this work, sort of what happens to certain kinds of women who are exposed to policing, to violence, to poverty, to certain kinds of selling and using drugs, those spaces, and those responses as a society.
Yeah, I think that double standard, how, I come from maybe like an upper middle class, like affluent community where a lot of the people I grew up with used drugs, and many of us did not experience over policing and criminal justice consequences. And it sounds like that's, obviously true for Harvard medical students. And so I think, pointing that out is uh, right off the top is so important, because what these women who you interviewed do are things that we all sort of do, and yet only they wind up in this sort of brutal system.
Exactly.
So, like one major theme in your book about these women is self-determination. How, in the face of structural violence, the women you got to know could they still, imagined a different life for themselves, and worked toward that, even despite so many barriers. Um, you know, I was wondering if you could maybe talk about one or a few women's stories in particular who kind of illustrate this concept of self-determination.
Yeah, I mean, so many of the women that I met and got to know over the course of my research really were just um, working so much harder than I could ever imagine that I myself was working at the time, both to survive, to take care of others. Um, I got to know someone who wanted to be called Serenity in the book. Um, and, I talk about her extensively. I would see her at the buprenorphine treatment clinic. I'd see her in jail. I'd see her in court. I'd see her in the hospital. So I really followed her and got to know her quite well. She had originally come from New Hampshire, and came through Western Mass and ended up in Boston, often kind of through the trajectories that people end up, kind of uh, what we call addiction trajectories. People were trying to, get clean, or they were trying to go to treatment programs. They kind of travel around different states in that way, also moving and following passive drugs. and then going into programs and kind of ending up that way and then coming out. And a lot of people end up in Boston. So Serenity ended up in Boston, and she really, I don't, she just worked incredibly hard. She would do sex work. She would also kind of sell drugs in a low level way. As we know, many people who use drugs often sell drugs. She was using drugs, selling drugs just to kind of maintain her own ability to use drugs. So this was heroin. And, so she just worked so hard, and I think about how hard I worked as a student or even how hard I work as a doctor. And the kind of labor that she was doing, her exposure to violence, her exposure to the elements, being homeless or being outside. I was just could never compare the kind of labor that I do to the kind of labor that she did to survive. Very much trying to, really just make it for herself and to live. And she was always thinking about her children, always trying to send money to them.
Yeah, and it sounds like in these stories, taking Serenity's circumstances into perspective here, that, like, why or how did a punitive approach become someone's idea of a way to help someone like Serenity? You kind of go into the history of incarceration and women. Can you sort of unpack the origin of the idea that someone like Serenity, is a criminal?
What's so interesting about this is the way in which we, came to criminalize the drug use of women in particular. I did archival research into the history of the state women's prison in Massachusetts. And we always had this sense, which got written into laws throughout the last 100 years or so, that we were going to save the quote unquote fallen women. And we had these very puritanical beliefs and these Christian narratives that really are deeply embedded into the moral ethos and also into legislation, really, in which we would incarcerate women or other people who used drugs, chronic inebriates, people who basically became dependent on alcohol, that we would incarcerate them or keep them for their own good. For women, for example, there were these deep double standards where people were kept for what was called the indeterminate sentence, which is that because women kind of had followed a fall in terms of this sense of moral purity, they would hold women for longer periods of time for the same sort of social taboos, breaking social taboos, than compared to men. So they would hold them for twice as long as they would men. And there were all of, women were incarcerated for abortion, for, what was felt to be stubbornness, all kinds of behaviors that were seen as deviant in that time, even going up through the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
So being stubborn is a criminal offense.
Yeah, so these were often poor and working class women, who really did not fit into our sense of upper middle class purity and femininity, especially women who had who drank or who used drugs or who kind of lived outside of these regular norms.
One another through line in your book is that I get from you personally is a deep sense of humility. You really confront the limits of medicine in your role as a doctor. You write about Serenity, quote, "I could give Serenity a medication to take away her cravings, but I couldn't stop the world she lived in from harming her or the ongoing harm she did to herself." And, I just think that's so important to listen to a bit more. Can you sort of talk about maybe broadly what it's like to be a doctor in the midst of we're in a national public health emergency with regard to overdoses. So on the one hand, your profession is tasked with treating this illness that's occurring en masse right now. But on the other, the problems that people like Serenity face also go far beyond anything you as a doctor can do. Can you sort of talk about that bind?
Right. So, I think it's really a huge privilege and an honor to care for people who use drugs. At the same time, there is a certain, especially as I've gone longer and seen more, taken care of more people, there's a certain witnessing that you also have to do, and a sense of accompaniment that are important as you recognize the limitations of what we can do in medicine. So it's very difficult to actually, to be providing care in the setting of our overdose crisis and daily witnessing kind of the violence that people have in their lives, and really witnessing it, but having very, very little that we are able to do to both solve it, prevent it, and heal from it. And, like I said, I can give buprenorphine for cravings, but there's a lot that people are seeking that's more than just, lack of cravings. And so, there's different ways that I think about it. I think about triaging people to keep them alive. And I spend a lot of my energy there with people who are really facing a ton of insults from homelessness, from poverty, from the criminal justice system. And so trying to keep people alive, I spend a lot of my time doing that. And then once people are kind of stabilized and people feel better, we can work on what it takes to achieve a sense of healing and well-being. And a lot of doctors, I think, don't necessarily have the equipment, the language, the time, the energy to either participate in either of those buckets to keep people alive, and then to get healing is really hard. So, for example, we have a lot of great emergency room doctors who are doing lots of innovative things, just trying to keep people alive. And, that's why in my work at Harm Reduction Coalition, I see it as so important, because we can really begin to address some of those things, such as criminalization of having a sterile syringe in many states in this country, right? Where someone is participating or having, something in their car that, but by all intents, they're taking care of themselves in a healthier way, but they're still incarcerated for possession of a syringe, for example. So, if that is why the work that I do is so limited, and I try to bring it up to the policy level, because I know these policies do harm.
I think maybe one thing I wanted to go a little deeper into is the quote unquote treatment that people experience while they're incarcerated. And so the Rhode Island Department of Corrections, like, as you know, they implemented a program that screened people for substance use disorders, and if people met certain criteria for opioid use disorder, they were offered either methadone, buprenorphine, or naltrexone. And we know over time that this led to significant reductions in overdose mortality. It led to a 12% drop in the whole state, which I think goes to show just how consequential treating people who are incarcerated for addiction actually is at the population level. And I think, I should add that most people in this Rhode Island program opted for buprenorphine. And it's amazing that, these kinds of outcomes, with this program, that it isn't like rapidly expanding to everywhere. A lot of places may only offer medication to women if they're pregnant. They may only offer naltrexone to people and not offer methadone or buprenorphine. Can you sort of talk about what barriers stand in the way of access to the gold standards of treatment inside of jails and prisons?
Yeah, so I think it's worth talking briefly about what happens to most people who become arrested and incarcerated in this country. So, in the majority of jails in this country, there is no access to medication for opioid use disorder. We have three FDA approved medications, as you mentioned, methadone, buprenorphine, and IM naltrexone. And yet, when someone who has an opioid use disorder becomes incarcerated in most places in this country, the traditional way that they are treated is with little to no medical attention. In most cases, people have a health screening when they come into a jail or prison. It might be recognized, and they may be given medications that are called quote unquote comfort medications that include medications to treat the symptoms of opioid withdrawal. So it might be something like ibuprofen for muscle pain. It might be something like Imodium for diarrhea, or Bentyl for gas. It might be even a medication like hydroxyzine, Vistaril, or Benadryl for insomnia. So there's a wide variety of symptomatic treatments that don't actually work that well to treat opioid withdrawal that might be given. People might be kept in a special health wing of the jail, or they might go to general population. Whereas in the community, we would and should be treating opioid withdrawal with medications to treat withdrawal, including buprenorphine and methadone, and then moving into a maintenance phase. So like you mentioned in the Rhode Island example, they were quite successful at getting people onto those medications, both to stabilize them in the immediate period to treat withdrawal, and then to bring them to a dose that effectively treats cravings and can block exogenous effects of other opioids. So it's just very striking right now, the moment that we're in, as people around the country are clamoring for access to these effective medications in jails and prisons. I liken it to taking care of people in the jail who might have had a heart attack, and they might be on medications, maybe starting 6 new medications after having a heart attack. And it's, a near fatal incident having a heart attack if you've survived it, and the chance of having another attack is very high, and you might have to be on medication for the rest of your life. And that's how I liken being on buprenorphine or methadone. If you've survived a non-fatal overdose, your chance of having another one is extremely high. And so if you come into the jail and you need your medication to treat your cholesterol because you had a heart attack, I would never just abruptly stop that medication. Or if I screened you and I saw that your cholesterol was alarmingly high, I would start you on that medication. And that's how we should be thinking about medication for opioid use disorder in jails. But there's so much stigma, and there's so much entrenched criminalization of sheriffs, of correctional officers, of these institutions whose purpose really exists in some way to exist off of the failure of ongoing failures of our society to really address it. So it's very compromising. In my research, I did point out that some correctional officers' unions lobby against treatment programs in their prisons and jails. And it's pretty deeply entrenched that people, there are vested interests that people have in people not getting better.
Right. So it's not that it's by any accident that these medications are withheld. There are wardens and, like you said, sheriffs and jailers who view these medications as contraband. Isn't that right?
Right. So I spent a chapter exploring kind of why local sheriffs or sheriffs in the jails and prisons really view this medication as contraband. Buprenorphine, one of the versions of buprenorphine that's available, Suboxone, the film, was particularly coveted and was particularly policed by internal prison staff and security as something that was a means for people to get high. And I documented and kind of talking to the women that I met in prison who would use buprenorphine inside illicitly, and a lot of them were trying to deal with the harsh reality of what prison intends to do, trying to alleviate the pain of being isolated from your family, their children, their community, being traumatized, the environment, exposure to violence, and we're just trying to make it like they've done on the outside. And instead, they would, if they got caught with it, they would get sent to solitary confinement or the hole, and that would further, it wouldn't really deter people from doing it in the first place, but it would further traumatize them.
Yeah, it's that chapter in particular was very illuminating about that stigma you mentioned and just the general attitudes and really just like rampant misinformation about what medication treatments are and how they work. And so much of my time as a writer is carefully stacking up the evidence that favors these medications, exactly against the misinformation. And it's like, Sisyphus. It's like I've written the same story a million times, and yet the attitudes persist. And I'm sure as a doctor, you feel the same way.
Yeah, I feel the same way. And I think it's worth examining what other medications in this country have so much stigma encoded and baked into them. I think there's very few other medications that have such a societal vilification and stigmatization that's baked into regulations. It's baked into, everyday discourse when people bring it up in an AA meeting. It's really on so many levels. It's so deeply entrenched, it it merits a further and deeper anthropological analysis of, sort of how we think about different classes of medications, why we would think so poorly of these, and pick them out as particular ones to hate.
You recently tweeted, you were quote tweeting the ACLU, who just filed a motion for emergency injunctive relief against the Bureau of Prisons because they have a blanket ban on these medications, I think with certain maybe exemptions for pregnant women. And what you quote tweeted was exactly what you were talking about now. You ask, for what other common and life-saving medications do we have to file lawsuits so patients can continue them if they become incarcerated? And it's right. I don't know any other medicine that falls into this category.
And it's not even a matter of cost, right? I mean, because the medications methadone is extremely cheap. It's pennies for the liquid formulation, and buprenorphine is now generic, and there's many different versions that are competing and driving the cost down. So, if for example, a jail or prison is buying insulin, long-acting insulin called Lantus, the price of that, as you might have known from our national debates around the cost of insulin, has jumped, exponentially, right? So many offer that, and there's no debate about who's going to pay for it.
Yeah, there's always the question of how do we pay for this, when I think the costs of untreated addiction are they far outweigh the costs of treating addiction.
Right. And it gets into some complex health economics about who pays for what medication where, under what status is this person right now? Is this person in a county, state, federal? Do they have, when you become incarcerated, you lose access or are suspended or from Medicaid. But as you probably know, people who are incarcerated are the only group of people that have a constitutional right to health care. So it's very interesting that we still have to have these almost daily fights, and we're having fights like this in every single state and on every single jurisdiction, because as you are familiar with, sheriffs who run their county jail have total control over their county jail, and so if there's 100 counties in a state or 50 counties in a state, then it's up to everyone's discretion, and no one has any say about this. I was teaching a class at Harvard Medical School to some of the doctors from other countries, and they were like, why doesn't the government just make everyone half the medication when they're at increased chance of dying? And it was a great question, but other countries, these comparative health systems where they have stronger, central governments, right? And we have, this distributed state model with different powers against the federal government and all these other things, but we just don't have, our country has such a unique framework that, I was shocked, that they asked that question, and it's a good one. But I couldn't imagine a world where we just had medications that were WHO essential medications available in all facilities, around the country. That would be shocking.
Yeah, shocking that medications that we know save lives be made available to people.
Yeah, everywhere.
And I think what this point really leads to at the macro level, that I think people, especially like journalists kind of covering the opioid crisis or overdose crisis, whatever we're in right now, is that incarceration and policing are rarely identified as drivers of overdose and death. So, for instance, we know that people leaving incarceration, people leaving these settings, correctional settings, they are at astronomically higher rates of overdosing and dying than the general population. And when we have millions of people sort of churning through the system every year, and a not insignificant number of them have an addiction or are struggling with their addiction, and statistically, many of them, after leaving, will die of an overdose. It is so clear to me, looking at this system from way above it, that the jails, the correctional settings are drivers of overdose.
They're a huge driver of overdose. And to prevent that, we should prevent sending people to prison and jail in the first place. And I fight on all levels for, preventing that from happening. And at the same time, advocating for medications in these facilities now, because until we can envision a world where no one has to go to prison or jail for a substance use disorder, we will still have people being incarcerated and set up for disproportionately high risk of overdose and death after leaving facilities such as these in 2 weeks. I think there is now some increased recognition of the role that jails and prisons are playing. For example, last year, the National Sheriff's Association put out a pretty good pamphlet on expanding access to medication for addiction treatment for opioid use disorder in correctional facilities. So, I think we're at a moment where things are changing. People are still dying. I think the change is happening very slowly. In my work at Harm Reduction Coalition, I provide technical assistance to jails in New York State who are starting treatment programs with buprenorphine and methadone. So I help set them up for success, help design their policies and procedures for giving the medication to patients safely, and how to transition them and get them back home with the medication that they need to prevent people from dying. So this is happening. It's just happening very slowly.
Right. It's like we should obviously be in favor of programs like Rhode Island and Rikers that provide quality care for people with addiction. But at the same time, we should also be thinking about a world where people with addiction are not criminalized and sent to jail in the first place.
Right. So I feel like if, someone wanted to give me a multi-million-dollar grant, I could set up a shop, that would be, send me everyone that I ever encountered in my book and send them to me and my friends, and we'll take care of them, not in a prison or jail.
I would love to see that happen.
And I would love to see that happen because it would be not just about providing people the medications that they need, but really trying to address what has led them to that, and taking their expertise, taking their knowledge, taking them as people with tons of experience and real value to that enterprise, and really finding ways for them to both get well and to really make lives for themselves that are meaningful and that really give them a sense of purpose. And so many of the women that I talked to in my book really wanted to be addiction counselors. They really wanted to help other people and care for other people. And they were effectively shut out of these opportunities in formal labor markets because of their histories of incarceration. And so I could envision, just in a in a wonderful world, just taking, people like the people that I encountered in my research and people that I take care of today, my patients, and, giving them opportunities to, engage in ways where they can really make a huge difference. And they have a wealth of expertise and knowledge about things that I could never know. And they should be paid for that and be able to make a living and also derive a sense of self-efficacy and meaning to their lives that so many people struggle for.
That sounds amazing. And it's an opportunity that a lot of people who do drugs or have some form of problematic or chaotic drug use, a lot of people do eventually get that opportunity. But for these women who are sort of walking around with scarlet letters, the very thing that might be able to help them stabilize their lives, like you're saying, like a meaningful job that gives them, that uses their expertise and also provides a lot of meaning. They don't get to do that, and it keeps them stuck and churning in and out of these sort of brutal places.
Yeah, churning or dead. I talk about Lydia, and Lydia's death really impacted me very deeply when I found out that she overdosed in her mother's bathroom and was found dead. And so I'm just glad that I got a chance to know her, and she really wanted me to tell her story. And so I just think about that. That motivates me very strongly to continue doing the work that we do, because these are preventable.
Yeah, I can't imagine what it, would feel like to be, with someone and learning about them and getting to know them. And then, yeah, in just one moment, this person vanishes. And like you're saying, there's so much untapped potential and creativity and expertise among these women that, as a doctor, you see, but the status quo, really keeps that potential, um, you know, closed in.
Right. And it's hidden, and a lot of people don't really care to or believe that people who use drugs have expertise and are valuable to society. And that's really a very predominant feeling. And I tell people to go read the book by the historian Markell at University of Michigan, um, Anatomy of Addiction, that's about Freud and William Halsted, so that their relationships with cocaine. And William Halsted was one of the quote fathers of modern surgical technique. He's the one who taught us how to use antiseptic technique for surgeries, which was clearly life-saving and changed the way that we were able to operate in ways where people didn't die of raging infections and sepsis. And mastectomies, he was one of the, innovators of that technique for breast cancer. And, he's done countless things for surgery, but basically spent his life, injecting cocaine. And then he went to treatment where they gave him morphine for that. So he basically was doing cocaine and morphine, operating, going in and out of, his troubled kind of use for decades. And he was extremely productive and extremely useful and extremely valuable to medicine, and was working, in ways that we would not necessarily want him to be. And he was plagued by demons, and he struggled with substance use his entire career, but at the same time was an educated, privileged white doctor who was able to, maintain, um, work with that privilege and continue working in the field, and contributed immensely. So I think about what allowed him to succeed and continue to contribute in a meaningful way and develop expertise and train other doctors. And, then I think about the women like Lydia and Serenity, and I think about their vast um, realms of expertise and how, they're denigrated. No one listens to them. No one cares for them. No one cares about them, and they're shut out of the formal labor market. And so it's a huge contrast, and it stems from the underlying belief, that social belief that's predominant and prevailing, that we believe that people who use drugs, their lives don't matter, and that they're not worthwhile, and they don't contribute in meaningful ways to our society. And that's very harmful to them, and it's deadly.
I can't help but think that someone like Dan Big is a modern corollary to, Halstead or Freud in a way, where Dan liberated a drug called naloxone from strictly being used in medical settings, and was instrumental in distributing that to everyone everywhere. And he, died last year from an overdose. And no one, I think a lot of people maybe were taken aback that the executive director of this of this instrumental nonprofit in Chicago could have saved so many lives and changed society in such a dramatic way.
Certainly, I would certainly think that comparison is accurate. It's very spot on. And his life and is an inspiration to all of us. That despite kind of ongoing struggle, and despite what people are going through, people who use drugs just have immense potential and a lot to give, and can really change society, can change policies, and really can save lives.
So, we're almost at the hour, and to kind of close out, I wanted to think back to something you said about, in this perfect world where you and your friends can treat these women instead of jails and prisons, and not only just keep them alive and stabilize them, but also address the problems in their life, that the burdens that they're carrying and the things that happened to them and the horrors they witnessed. In among the women you spoke to, like, how rampant was maybe sexual abuse or physical abuse or trauma in their lives, probably long before they used drugs ever?
Oh, extremely common. The percentage was basically everyone would have classified as having some form of physical, verbal, emotional, sexual abuse. And, some started, some dated back, to very young, to when they were children. Thinking about adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, thinking about, how could these have been prevented? How could they have grown up in a different world? That was something that I spent a lot of time talking to people like Serenity about. And the real problem is the way in which they embrace this dominant narrative that it was their fault and that they could have simply made a better choice. I'm not saying that, their lives were determined and they were destined to use substances. I'm not saying that at all, but they really embraced this dominant culture that it was their fault and they were to blame and they should have just made a better choice. And really, we know that's not how addiction or problematic or chaotic substance use works. And that's why I go into such depth in the book talking about people's lives and their experiences, because they come across, feeling very strongly this social belief that it's their fault and they're to blame. And they get caught in the cycle of blame and guilt and shame and blame and guilt and shame, which really is not an effective place for change. We know that from the medical literature about behavior change in general, that, shame really doesn't, it makes people feel really bad. It often leads to more shame, and it doesn't really work that effectively. The negative emotions that people have really can't, they really get caught in a cycle of it. So, I try to present people's lives in really detailed and complex ways, including trauma, and try to just show that we really, to kind of take some of the blame off of them, and to envision ways in which um, we can not have a society that does this to women, that treats them very harshly, that holds them to a double standard, that shuts them out of the labor market, that criminalizes substance use during pregnancy, and all of these things that make their lives so complex, and yet so very like harsh and hard. So I hope that the book helps people understand that. And I would love to envision a place where people didn't have to go to prison and jail. And whenever anyone says jail saved my life, like Serenity says to me, I completely turn it around and I say, you saved your own life. You know what I mean? Like you, what are the conditions that you had at jail that we can give for you on the outside, or that we haven't been able to provide for you on the outside? How can we get you a place of respite and healing and structure and the daily sense of safety that you have maybe while incarcerated that you don't have on the outside? So when I try to change the narrative for them a little bit about, not that jail saved my life, but that you saved your own life, you're a survivor, and how have society failed you to make you think that jail saved your life, and how can we change those circumstances?
Yeah, I think that, that kind of reframe, that, you know, it is very entrenched among, people in recovery that I've interviewed and that I've spoken to, that refrain, that jail saved their life. I hear that often, and I can't help but think, like you, did it, but also like what about jail, or what was happening there that was perhaps therapeutic, or what wasn't. But I think the larger point that you're getting at here is, if we can organize society in such a way that reduces the likelihood of young people and young women experiencing such cruelty and brutality, that ultimately, down the road, it will prevent so many problems that are at, quote, epidemic levels, like suicide and drinking and overdose and all these problems that are, for the past 2 decades have been rising and rising and rising.
And when people say jail saved my life, we can unpack that being like, having a roof over your head saved your life. Having 3 square meals saved your life. Having access to a doctor saved your life. Having access to, you know, various, a structure, having access to some educational opportunities, having a sense of a place where you weren't going to get assaulted or raped by your partner. All those things don't have to do with jail. But, so when people say jail saved my life, those are all the things that they're referring to, that we should be able to envision and put into place for people that is not a carceral institution. And that's when I talk about having a place for people my dream being having a place for people like the women in my book is being able to provide those things for them. And we do that in scattered ways, in this country, but it's, we might provide one thing or the other thing, and nothing is really centralized, easy. There's no one-stop shop for it all. You might have housing, but you might not have access to a psychiatrist or for trauma-informed care, or, so we have these dislocated care systems where you might have access to some of those, but it would be really wonderful to have all of those services and features of getting better from substance use disorders in the same place, with access to medication, with access to exercise or healing or yoga or whatever, housing, nutrition, all of the things that make people feel really not only live but thrive, would be wonderful.
Agreed. And I think that's why your book is so important, because it illustrates exactly the need for that kind of society that you have a vision for. And I just want to thank you so much for working every day to make that a reality.
Thank you so much for having me on Narcotica.
You're so welcome. So the book is Getting Wrecked by Dr. Kimberly Sue. Getting Wrecked: Women, Incarceration, and the American Opioid Crisis. Thanks so much for coming on. This was incredible.
It's been great. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Narcotica. You can follow us on Twitter at NarcoCast or on narcocast.com. Narcotica is an independent production by Christopher Moraff, Zachary Siegel, and myself, Troy Farah. Our co-producer is Aaron Ferguson, who has just been killing it lately, and our theme music is by Glass Boy. Additional music by Pictures of the Floating World. Narcotica is sponsored by Billy Bob's Big Long Slong-Shaped Bongs. Just kidding, that's a made-up product, I hope. In all seriousness, we don't want to clutter this program with stupid ads, so thank you so much to our Patreons who help keep this program free from corporate influence. We couldn't do it without you. If you want to help us out, join dozens of pro-drug advocates on our Patreon, or help us get the word out. Give us a rating wherever you get your podcasts. We're finally on Spotify. Tell your friends about us, and carve our name into the bathroom mirror at Burger King. If you want to send us a suggestion, tell us about the medical benefits of cocaine, or just want to say hi, you can email us at tips@narcocast.com. That's all for now. Take care.